There's a family you never elected, never hired, and probably never heard of by name. But every time you open a carton of milk, juice, or cream, every single time, you're touching their product. The carton isn't just packaging, it's territory. And that territory covers 160 countries. A single Swedish family controls the technology that packages 40% of Europe's milk. That produced 178 billion units in a single year. That generated $18.5 billion in revenue without going public, without answering to the market, without a single Wall Street analyst being able to audit their complete numbers because they simply refused to disclose them. And when European regulators finally investigated how they maintained that control, they found something the company itself couldn't deny. For at least 15 years, Tetra Pak had operated as a near monopoly, with 90 to 95% of the aseptic market, using practices the European Commission classified as abuse of dominant position. The fine was levied, the company paid, and carried on exactly as before. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Every episode here is one piece of the same puzzle about how real power works. Tell me in the comments, did you know this family existed? And what city in the world are you watching from right now? Ruben Rausing was born in 1895 in a fishing village called Raå in southern Sweden. There was no money in the family, no connections. There was the sea and the smell of fish and a Sweden that had not yet become the welfare state model the world would admire decades later. What Ruben had was an ability to notice what others ignored. He studied at the Stockholm School of Economics and won a scholarship to Columbia University in New York. He arrived in the United States in the early 1920s and saw something no European had yet systematized: self-service stores. Pre-packaged products. Consumers choosing from shelves without needing a clerk to weigh and wrap each item. For a provincial Swede, that was the future made visible ahead of schedule. Rausing returned to Europe with one certainty: whoever controlled the packaging would control food retail. Not the product itself, the packaging. The logic was simple and brutal. The product changes, the producer changes. But packaging is always necessary. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure, properly positioned, creates dependency. In 1929, the same year as the Wall Street crash, as the financial world collapsed, Ruben Rausing and Erik Åkerlund founded in Malmö the first packaging-specialized company in Scandinavia. Åkerlund and Rausing started with cardboard boxes for dry foods, modest, functional, invisible to the public. But Rausing was already thinking about something else. In the early 1940s, he turned his attention to a problem no one had adequately solved: how to package milk hygienically, cheaply, and practically, at a time when the product was sold in bulk, in metal canisters with all the contamination and waste that implied. The technical challenge was enormous. Milk is perishable. Packaging liquids efficiently requires precision in the shape of the container, the material, and, crucially, the filling and sealing process. In 1944, a lab assistant named Erik Wallenberg had the idea that would change everything: a tetrahedron-shaped package built from a continuous tube of paper. The shape was mathematically elegant. Nobel physics laureate Niels Bohr, visiting the factory the following decade, said he had never seen such a fitting practical application of a mathematical problem. Rausing filed the patent on March 27, 1944. His wife, Elizabeth, reportedly suggested the decisive operational detail: sealing the packages through the liquid itself as the tube was filled, exactly the way sausage casings are sealed. This eliminated air from the package during the process and guaranteed the seal. In 1951, AB Tetra Pak was formally established in Lund, Sweden, as a subsidiary of Åkerlund and Rausing. In 1952, the first machine producing 100 milliliter cream tetrahedra was delivered to a local dairy cooperative. The product worked. The question now was scale. And scale is where the Rausing family showed there was something beyond technical talent in their formula. The expansion was methodical and relentless. Germany in 1954, France the same year, Italy in 1956, Switzerland in 1957, the Soviet Union in 1959. Hans Rausing, the founder's son, personally negotiated the first export of a Tetra Pak machine to Moscow, at a time when doing business with Soviets was as much a diplomatic achievement as a commercial one. Japan in 1962, Mexico in 1960, the United States in 1962. But the real leap came with two linked innovations. In 1963, Tetra Pak launched the Tetra Brik, a rectangular package, easier to transport and store than the original tetrahedron. And in 1968, the aseptic version of that same carton, the Tetra Brik aseptic. That combination was what transformed the company from a regional manufacturer into a global force. Aseptic technology is the heart of everything. In aseptic processing, the product and the packaging are sterilized separately and then combined in a sterile environment. The result, milk, juice, cream, any liquid food treated at ultra-high temperature, can be stored at room temperature for up to a year without refrigeration, without added preservatives. For countries with weak cold chain infrastructure, this wasn't convenience. It was a logistical revolution. In the card above, we showed how Standard Oil built its dominance through secret railroad rebates. Tetra Pak used a similar logic, only with machines and cartons as the tool of lock-in. And it was precisely here that the business model began to reveal its most strategic and most troubling dimension. Tetra Pak wasn't just selling packaging, it was selling filling machines. And the machines were designed to use exclusively Tetra Pak cartons. Buy the machine? You bought the dependency. To keep the warranty, to receive technical service, to avoid voiding the equipment, you had to use their cartons, not a competitor's, not a generic product. Tetra Pak cartons, or cartons approved by Tetra Pak. The difference between the two options was irrelevant in practice. The company approved only what didn't threaten its control. This mechanism is elegant in its brutality. The machine is the Trojan horse. The carton is the conquered city. By 1981, the company had 6,800 employees and was pulling in over $1 billion a year. By 1990, it was producing 50 billion packages annually. By 1983, the year Ruben Rausing died, it was already over 30 billion units per year. He died at 88 on the same Swedish country estate he had kept, even after moving his tax residency to Rome in 1969. Because that's another layer of the Rausing family story. They build empires in Sweden, but don't pay taxes there. Rausing Sr. moved to Rome. Hans Rausing, in the early 80s, moved to the United Kingdom to avoid Swedish taxation. In 1981, Tetra Pak's corporate headquarters were transferred to Lausanne, Switzerland, for tax reasons, according to the company itself, which kept all research and development in Lund. In 1984, much of the assets were transferred to a holding company registered in the Netherlands. The pattern is consistent. Build in Sweden, profit from the world, pay taxes nowhere in particular. In 1991, Tetra Pak carried out the largest acquisition in Swedish history up to that point. It bought Alfa Laval AB, a company specializing in industrial processing and agricultural equipment, for $2.5 billion. The logic was total vertical integration. Tetra Pak could now offer not just the packaging, but the entire product processing system before it was packaged. From treating the milk to the carton on the shelf, all under the same umbrella. The merger created the Tetra Laval Group, formalized in 1993 with dual headquarters in Lund and Lausanne. But that move attracted attention the family preferred to avoid. The European Commission had launched an investigation even before the Alfa Laval acquisition. What regulators found was documented in detail, the company never fully contested. In the aseptic market, packaging for long-life products like UHT milk and juices, Tetra Pak held between 90 and 95% market share. The only real competitor was PKL, controlled by Swiss company SIG, with the remaining 5 to 10%. 95%. That's not a dominant position. It's a monopoly with a different name. The Commission documented what it called abuse of that position going back to at least 1976. For 15 years, the company had engaged in practices European regulation explicitly prohibits: tying sales between machines and cartons, predatory pricing to eliminate competitors in non-aseptic markets, and the acquisition of Liquipak, its only rival in the aseptic segment, for the purpose of eliminating competition. In July 1991, the decision was formal: a fine of 75 million ECU, equivalent to roughly $88 million at the time. The company appealed. The Court of First Instance upheld the decision in 1994. Tetra Pak appealed again to the European Court of Justice. In November 1996, the court confirmed the fine would stand. They paid and carried on. Because 75 million ECU for a company earning more than $1 billion a year was not punishment. It was the operating cost of 15 years of monopoly. The arithmetic favored the offender. What happened next in China proves the lesson was not learned, or that it was learned differently than intended. In the Chinese market, Tetra Pak built a position even more extreme than in Europe. In 2004, the company was estimated to control 95% of China's aseptic packaging market. When the melamine scandal contaminated Chinese milk in 2008, an episode in which Tetra Pak had no direct involvement, the Chinese government tightened regulations and the sector suffered. But the company survived and remained dominant. In January 2012, an anonymous complaint reached China's State Administration for Industry and Commerce, the SAIC. The investigation lasted nearly 5 years. The investigators used foreign experts. They documented conduct between 2009 and 2013. In November 2016, the decision: a fine of 667.7 million renminbi, approximately 91 million euros. The largest amount ever imposed by the SAIC in the enforcement of China's anti-monopoly law. The conduct was nearly identical to what Europe had documented 25 years earlier. Tying. Buyers of Tetra Pak machines were required to use Tetra Pak cartons to maintain equipment warranties. Supplier exclusivity. The only Chinese manufacturer of the specific kraft paper for the cartons had signed an exclusivity contract with Tetra Pak, and the SOIC ruled that the company had no right to prevent competitors from accessing that material, since it did not own the paper technology. Loyalty discounts, structured in a way that made it economically irrational for customers to switch suppliers. That last category was particularly significant. It was the first time Chinese anti-monopoly authorities had applied the concept of loyalty discounts as a violation of the law. Tetra Pak was the test case. But there's a third episode the company prefers not to discuss, one that involves not regulation, but a financial scandal with the smell of bribery. In January 2004, Parmalat, Italy's largest dairy group with operations in 26 countries, collapsed. Its owner, Callisto Tanzi, was arrested. The accounting hole was 14 billion euros, one of the largest corporate frauds in European history. As Italian authorities dug through Parmalat's books, the company's CFO, Fausto Tonna, told the business newspaper Il Sole 24 Ore that Tetra Pak had made substantial payments to Tanzi personally, to his family, and to a Cayman Islands company belonging to Parmalat. Tetra Pak confirmed the payments. It said they were commercial discounts, standard practice with large clients. Italian authorities requested documentation. The company provided what it had. The payments had been recorded since 1995 as part of regular operations. No Tetra Pak executives were indicted. Hansi was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud. The case was closed, at least for the packaging company. What remained unanswered was the more uncomfortable question. If the payments were just commercial discounts, why had a portion of them been routed through an offshore company in the Cayman Islands belonging to the group? Commercial discounts don't go through the Caymans, but investigation means access to documents. And documents, the Rausing family learned to control with surgical precision. The current structure of the Rausing family's wealth was mapped by Bloomberg in July 2025, and what the reporters found is an architecture of opacity that operates on multiple layers. At the top sits the Haldor Foundation, registered in Liechtenstein, a principality of 160,000 inhabitants with no automatic extradition and secrecy laws among the strictest in Europe. The Liechtenstein Office of Justice confirmed to Bloomberg that only authorized individuals can access information about the foundation. Below Haldor are operating subsidiaries in Singapore, Winder Investments Printing and Winder Patent, which have periodically received injections of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. In Switzerland, 2 wealth management firms, Longbow Finance SA, which manages roughly $835 million in portfolio assets, including hedge funds, private credit, and real estate, and Fremont Management SA, with $304 million in assets, founded in 1994 and still registered as a subsidiary of Tetra Laval itself as of May 2025. The family's total investment portfolio exceeds $9 billion, spread across more than 100 companies in Europe and the United States. The vast majority is concentrated in 5 positions: $1.9 billion in international flavors and fragrances, $2.4 billion in Linde plc, $2.2 billion in Givaudan, plus stakes in Sensient Technologies and SIG Group, the same company that held 5 to 10% of the European market that Tetra Pak didn't control. The Rausing family invests in Tetra Pak's main competitor as a financial hedge. Jörn, Finn, and Kirsten Rausing, Gad's 3 children, Ruben's grandchildren, inherited the business in 1995, when Gad bought out his brother Hans's share for $7 billion, the largest private buyout in Europe at the time. Hans had moved to the United Kingdom, then accumulated an estimated fortune of $10 billion before dying in 2019. The 3 siblings, now in their 60s and 70s, share equal control of Tetra Laval. Individual estimated net worth, $5.9 billion each. Tetra Laval does not publish complete financial results. How much profit is generated, how much is distributed to the owners, no outside analyst can calculate with precision. Representatives of the company and all its investment entities declined to comment when Bloomberg asked. That refusal to comment is itself a form of power. You don't need to defend what no one can verify. And while Europe's and China's regulators spent years documenting abuses and levying fines that the company absorbed as a cost of doing business, Tetra Pak built a different narrative, that of the socially responsible company. In the late 1970s, Ruben Rausing participated in Operation Flood, a partnership between the World Food Program, the World Bank, and Tetra Pak to bring surplus Western milk to Indian families. In 2000, the company created the Food for Development Office, working with governments and NGOs on school milk programs, an initiative it says it has supported since 1962. When the first school milk program involving Tetra Pak was launched in Mexico. In 2022, it conducted commercial trials of an alternative to the aluminum layer in cartons, using a paper-based barrier that increases recyclability by up to 90%. The family's philanthropy is real. The Julia and Hans Rausing Trust donates £50 million a year. Sigrid Rausing, Hans's daughter, edits a literary magazine and writes memoirs. Lisbeth Rausing is a philanthropist and writer. And Hans Christian Rausing, Hans's son and Ava's husband, was arrested in July 2012 when his wife's decomposed body was found in their apartment in Belgravia, London. She had died 2 months before being discovered, from cocaine abuse. The story ended up in a memoir written by Sigrid Rausing titled Mayhem: The Human Tragedy of a Family That Never Lacked for Money. Tetra Pak entered the 21st century, producing 178 billion packages a year, 160 countries, $18.5 billion in annual revenue. The Tetra brick package, that ubiquitous rectangle, was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2004 in the show Humble Masterpieces. In 2011, the Science Museum in London displayed it in Hidden Heroes, the genius of everyday things. And that's the question that stays with you after you put the milk back in the fridge. It's not about Ruben Rausing, who left a fishing village with an idea about the future of retail and built one of the largest private companies on the planet. That part of the story is, in fact, extraordinary. Real talent, real vision, and execution few could have matched. The question is about the system Tetra Pak built around that innovation, about how a patent becomes a barrier to entry, how a machine becomes an instrument of dependency, how 95% market share can be maintained for decades across 2 separate continents, with regulators documenting abuses and levying fines that function as a toll, not a punishment. The question is about what happens when the innovation ends and the control begins. When the company that invented something genuinely useful decides that the most efficient path to maintaining its power is not to keep innovating, but to make it impossible for anyone who's entered to leave. Every monopolist starts with a better idea. Few end with only that. If you want to keep understanding how this mechanism repeats itself, with other names, in other industries, with the same logic, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Every episode here takes apart a different piece of the same machine. Give it a like if this story surprised you. That's the signal it's worth continuing. And tell me in the comments, which company today do you think is operating on this same model? What's the carton of milk of our time?